Hey guys, this is Barewire with HUSNG.com. Today I'm doing a brief free video, hopefully reasonably long, on account of this will be the last video I'm releasing for a while. So what I did was this is a 3-tabling match that I played just a couple days ago against Floppy Nuts 09. I haven't played him in a little while, probably some amount of action 2 or 3 months ago, but nothing super recent. But he's a tough regular at 5'10", someone who I've played a reasonable amount with, and I don't have. Well, I don't like to go into specific reads in videos like this, so I'm going to keep the content within whatever information is available during these hands. So the table on the right is a situation. It's a board texture that I like to use large sizing on. And if I haven't explained this before, it's because it's a very favorable range for the type of hands it's a very favorable board for the type of hands that are usually in the big blind's 3-betting range. So what I'm doing is I'm exploiting the fact that there's a substantially larger number of hands in my range that connect well with this board and can use this type of sizing. The runout's actually sort of interesting. So I think on the flop and turn, my hand selection is pretty standard for a bluff. And what's interesting is that on the river, there's a lot of value hands that we were representing on the turn that are no longer really all that strong, because our opponent can have presumably the majority of King Jack and Queen Jack and Jack 10, all of which become the nuts on the river. And yeah, so it's a rainbow board, so I think those should be the only jacks that he really ever has. But it's still a substantial amount. King Jack, Queen Jack, and 10 Jack are 12 combinations each, ignoring the fact that I have a Jack myself. If you include that, they're 9 combinations each. But 36 potential straights for him is no small amount. And sort of likewise, he should expect me to have a substantial number of jacks that were bluffing on earlier streets. Just hands like I have, like Jack 9, Jack 8, and Jack 10 as well. I think he should expect that I play this way. Potentially Ace Jack if I value bet that size on the turn. So basically both of us can have a large number of straights here, and for that reason I don't think that it makes all that much sense to use a large bet size on the river and expect to get called by something that isn't just a chop. So I think it's quite logical to use a very small sizing on this specific river. Well, I shouldn't say this specific one. Basically a Jack or a 10 river on either either a Jack river or a 10 river, I think, is a logical spot to size quite small. This hand on the left, I defended pocket 5s to a 3-bet. Sort of just a low equity hand that I'm gonna give up. I know it's extremely unlikely that my hand is good, except for on this river, of course. It's extremely unlikely on the flop or turn that my hand is good, but at the same time, I have a 2-outer. I can just bluff with better hands, basically. On the right, we get raised small, and I mean, certainly it's possible that he's rebluffing or trying to rebluff a hand like, I don't know, just like Ace 8 or something, and just decided that my small sizing meant that I could be going for thin value with like pocket kings or whatever. That said, there's really not that much to this situation. We just stick it in because we have the first nuts, and he also has the first nuts, so we chop it. Nothing too weird there. I think on the river we have a pretty clear raise with pocket fives. The sizing is, I suppose, worth noting. Certainly I could decide to make it, well, I'm torn because neither of us should ever really be expected to have Jack 10. It's quite hard for me to represent the idea that I decided to check behind the turn once I made the nuts. That said, it's probably more plausible that I have Jack 10 than he does. But at the same time, if we assign that extremely low probability of either of us having it, the new like nutted hands become like aces, kings, queens, which are more likely for floppy nuts to have, because he 3-bet and I did not 4-bet basically. It's reasonable that he would play. Most reasonable that he would play pocket queens this way, I think, out of all the nutted hands, because checking the flop is quite standard, and he could have been going for a check raise on the turn, or a trap and a check raise on the river or something. But I'm still pretty comfortable raising here and just representing, basically just, I'm representing that I'm attacking his bet sizing. He bets small, so a big portion of his range should be thin value hands like, say, King Jack suited, or potentially something like pocket jacks. It's quite thin, but essentially I think that there's enough hands in his range that are going for thin value here that I would potentially want to run a bluff and essentially just represent that I have something like what I have, or some rivered hand that's strong enough, which would be like King 5 suited, Ace 5 suited, pocket fives, or just a trap where I have Jack 10 primarily. I don't really think there's much else to say. He just kind of has to. He's gonna have a bluff catcher almost every time, so he kind of just has to make a decision if I'm capable of bluffing enough here or not. I do believe he folds. So on the right, I guess another semi-interesting spot. So there's a lot of situations that I think a lot of people have picked up on leading small on the turn. This particular board is one that I decided to try against floppy nuts because I thought that on a paired board like this, he's reasonably likely to, like, it's kind of common on other board textures to lead an ace turn, and not so much a king turn. But I think that on a paired board like this, it's somewhat plausible that he checks behind more of his king highs, because ace high is a potential value betting hand on a board texture where ace high is basically, on a paired board, ace high is a stronger hand. So I think it's logical for him to value bet some of his ace highs on the flop, but be substantially more likely to check king high. So that makes the king sort of a favorable card for my range on paired boards. Not that the ace is also a favorable card for me, and I think I would lead both of them. But I think it's worth pointing out that on paired boards, I've started to make the same sort of small lead that I might make on board pairs and ace high turns. I've also started doing that on king high turns on a paired board. The hand on the left here, I can consider checking, I can consider c-betting. I like to do both sometimes, depending on, well, a lot of things. But I do think it's important to sometimes trap on boards like that where, well, boards where it's sort of difficult for you to barrel off every top pair on every variety of run out and expect to continue to get paid off every time. When that's not necessarily the case, like on a coordinated board and on a board that's difficult to bluff, I think it makes sense to check some top pair hands that are potentially not going to try and get 3 streets of value to protect, you know, your second pairs and your bluffs that give up and things of that nature. So I think the spot on the right is probably the last one I'm going to talk about because he shows up with a very interesting hand. So on the right I check behind pocket queens on an ace 8-4 two-tone board, which I think is quite standard. We can't really value bet, and our equity is, we're in very good shape against air, so I think it's quite okay to give a free card and, you know, catch bluffs on later streets. So the 6th turn is going to give him a lot of potential bluffs. He's going to have a lot of straight draws that want to fire. He'll have flush draws that want to fire. And so obviously we call pretty much any pair on this board, except maybe deuces and threes. And on the 10 river, so I suppose the idea here is that he's trying to represent that he led the turn with something like maybe 8-9 and thinks it's too thin to bet this river because some of his bluffs made a pair of 10s, or he's just representing that he has a hand like 10-7 or 10-9 that feels that it's too thin to bet twice, both of which are quite reasonable. So part of his range is going to be checking this river, like weak showdown hands. So what he decided to do here is he checked with pocket 8s, which actually, as far as hand selection goes, I think is quite good. And I'll explain why. One reason is that the most common hand for me to check behind on ace 8-4 and call 2 streets against a bluff is a pair of 8s. I think that should be somewhat obvious because a pair of 8s is pretty much going to check this flop 100% of the time. On a 6th turn, it's in very good shape, and on this run out, just for the sake of, you know, not folding too much, I'm very likely to call again with a pair of 8s. And expect him to be bluffing with hands like Queen 5 and Jack 7 and things of that, and Miss Diamonds and things of that nature. So when he has 2 8s, it's sort of unlikely that I check behind the flop and have a calling hand, but, you know, it's reasonably likely that I'll have a hand like 4-6, 10-4, 10-6, hands that made 2 pair at some point, and when check 2 will want to value bet. Or I could just have a hand like ace 3 that checked the flop and potentially wants to value bet on this river. So as basically, if he thinks that he needs to protect his checking range, which might include hands like 10-7 and 10-9, and doesn't want to face a bet all the time and just have no idea what to do, he occasionally checks some strong hands that can check raise, and I think this is a excellent choice of hand to do so. So I would say that this is a pretty good play by him. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and good luck at the tables.